Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to be in this room, which carries so much history with it and so much weight. I've stood here in other circumstances and had to defend myself. Ned has stood here and had to support me in my defense. I'm very, very pleased to present my good friend, Ned McGowan, composer, musician, extraordinary performer, and now writer. He's going to give a lay talk to introduce this afternoon, a talk in which he distills his dissertation into just a few minutes. Also a question of speed. And by doing so, he will give you an introduction to the main concepts behind his work. After that, the committee will come in and they will do a formal examination of Ned's competencies, qualities, and abilities. But this moment is an informal one for us to enjoy the benefit of his new knowledge. Thank you, Ned. Welcome.
Wow, thanks for that introduction, Guy. Really nice. And thank you all for coming today. It's really nice to see you all here at this big moment for me after so many years of work. And I'm so happy to share this research with you. So in the light of that, what I thought I would do for this lay talk was to talk about what the research I did was. And we have the dissertation here, the thesis. And so let's talk about it. It's called Speed in Music. And this research was an artistic research. So as Guy said, I'm a composer, a performer. I'm also a listener, and so the research methodology came out of the own questions that arose up during my artistic practice. So us musicians in our daily practice, we're always asking questions. Well, how does that work? How does this work? And we often sit around the table talking about them. And so this was a chance for me to really try to get into what speed is in music. Typically, when you ask what the speed is of a music, someone will say the tempo. And what we know is that all kinds of speeds of music can occur at the same tempo. So tempo seemed to not be the correct term for what speed is in music. So what is it then? And are we talking about the speed of notes? Are we talking about the harmonic speed? We talk about speed sometimes, but it's unclear what the speed is. So the answer that I came up with in this dissertation is that speed in music is the rate of perceptual events in time functioning across multiple independent yet concurrent time scales, and it is co-constructed by the music, the performer, the environment, and the listener. So very quickly we see that it's a very rich set of factors that go into what is speed in music. And for my dissertation, what I started out with was this chapter 2, in which I triangulate what speed is. And I started looking at the different elements that go into that. And I started with, well, what are the thresholds of speed? What is the range of speed that we can experience? So in order to do this, I took Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which was an inspiration from Stockhausen, and I stretched it out into 24 hours. And so you hear the symphony in a sort of stasis, and it's very beautiful. And then we created 25 different versions of the same symphony in faster versions, and just to see what the effect was. And it was very interesting, and I learned a lot from this experiment, because what I learned is that as you speed up this recording, there were changes at which the music just sounded faster. So we could sing da 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 or da 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 da, right? And it sounds like the same melody. But if we sped that up much faster, like that fast, all of a sudden the music changes in character. It changes its identity. It becomes a different music. So there's some sort of thresholds that the identity will go through as you speed it up. And then if you keep speeding it up, and I sped it up to 1/20th of a second, then it's like a really fast, the whole entire Ninth Symphony, which is quite funny. And then if you loop that, then it becomes a tone. And it becomes the tone at the lowest frequency range that we can detect. And so this kind of leads to the second facet or framework, which I was examining, is what are the technical specifications of the human body? So how fast and how slow can we hear? And those are pretty well measured by science. And so when you, so I looked all these things up, and indeed, when you repeat a sound 20 times a second, it becomes a low tone, and you go 40 times a second, it's an octave higher, and so forth. And so that's how we hear pitch, actually. And if you keep going faster, once you reach around 20,000 times a second, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, 20,000 times a second, it becomes unhearable because it's too fast for our sensory systems. So that was that's the what we could call the temporal resolution of the human body. And I also looked at how that compares to other animals, and it's interesting how bats can have different temporal resolutions. So there's a very strong system about the way our bodies work. Now, let's move on to the next framework, where I looked at density in motion. Because if we talk about 90 beats per minute, that's actually a measurement of density. We're talking about a number of beats and a length of time. And this is how we measure speed, actually. But of course, these quantifications of the speed of time or speed of events in music, they don't tell us anything about the quality of the music. And so that's an interesting thing when you want to compare that with the idea of motion in music, which is part of that same framework, because we know that music does move forward. And there are tools like harmony and pitch motion and cadences, which have to do with motion in music. And so the way music moves in music is concerning motion, and density is one way to create motion through changes in density. And there were some composers like Xenakis who utilized techniques of altering the changes in density, which would then create motion, in addition to these other tools I talked about. The fourth framework concerns smooth and striated time. And that is basically, striated means subdivided in regular subdivisions, and smooth means irregular. And these are really simple qualities, but the more you look at them, and the more you look at them under a microscope, the richer those differences become. Because what we realize is that all music has some combination of smooth and striated. 3 minutes. Wow. So that, well, maybe there'll be some questions about that. I also looked into the context of how music is experienced. So we have the music, we have the environment, and we have the listener. And that's also the facets that are essential for how we experience music. And I didn't talk about that last night, but each one of those facets also has a situation, which is a cultural situation and historical and political. And so all the elements in this model of the music and the environment and the listener are situated. And that's also an interesting parameter to consider when understanding what speed is in music. Now, to quickly move forward, because this was part one of my dissertation, what is speed in music? And the second part of my research question is, how did I use it creatively in my own work? And this is really the meat of the artistic research, where I do 3 different chapters. Number 1 is on tuplets, which are subdivisions of the beats, and I go very much into the different characters of the different tuplets and the different speed changes that occurs between them. The next chapter, I talked a lot about polytempo music. And this was really interesting because it kind of brought me head to head with science. When you have like someone playing at tempo 60 and another person playing at 61, you get this really difficult to maintain phasing effect. And so I researched metronomes to give you your tempo, and then looked at the different modalities from which we can use metronomes, which are either visual, audible, or haptic, which you can feel. So, and that was interesting because it really showed the boundaries between what science would tell us and what artistic research might solve in the artistic practice. And then the 5th chapter, which I'll try to say in a few seconds, was about a solo piece which I improvised as fast as possible, which also illuminated the technical specifications of my own body and my own physical technique and my own ideas and the music I had practiced and learned my entire life and my own ideas about form and phrasing and structure, all taking place in a really short amount of time. And that was then, took me 4 minutes to improvise it. It took me 2 months to transcribe it, and then 2 other musicians have performed that piece. And then it was very interesting to look at what was the difference in my speeds, improvising, and what was the difference in their speeds, which they had practiced and then performed. And then you could really see what were the things that were pre-learned, so embodied knowledge, and what were the things that they could practice and whip off, which were faster than what I had created in the moment. Shall I just keep talking until I'm cut off? Yeah. Because there's one other part about this chapter 5, which I'm really excited about, which is a model I call the speed of creation model, and it's a relationship between how fast we create something, and in this case it was real time. Sorry. Oh, there it is.
Goedemiddag, good afternoon.
Middag.
Please be seated. I herewith open the examination. Esteemed candidates, your paronyms, members of the examination committee, and all those present here today in the auditorium. We don't have a member of the committee online. Welcome to these proceedings. Esteemed candidate, again, you are standing before a committee appointed by the doctorate board of the University of Leiden, who are willing to examine you on your dissertation and on the accompanying propositions. And the discussion will now be opened by Dr. Phillips, Royal Northern College of Music. Dr. Phillips, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Esteemed candidate, it's very special for me to see how you've brought my work on music and time and the Lemmy model into the work that you have done, and how you've developed and very much expanded on this and other work on music and time with your ideas. For example, in your thoughts around digital music making and human limits. I'm not a composer, and I have huge admiration for the work that you've done, and congratulations once again on a wonderful showcase of your music yesterday. As my model outlines and as you beautifully articulate, Only some of the aspects of time perception are shaped by the composer. What do you think composers can learn from your work with speed in music? And how can we take your research to institutions such as my own music conservatoire and music departments around the world?
Zeer geleerde opponents, Phillips. I was happily influenced by your model, the Lemmy model, because it put into context this whole situation of how speed exists in music. And on one hand, it's very simple, but on the other hand, it's very rich, and that's what was really powerful about it. And in terms of what composers could learn from my work and how speed works in music concerning this situation, really it's the situation that gives us the identity. So if you can imagine a composer sitting in their workspace, small room with the computer screen, listening to a composition which they have made, played back by Finale or Dorico, and they say, yeah, tempo 80, that's the perfect tempo, just by listening to it. Then that's written into the score, and then that score is then given to the musicians, and the musicians have to then practice it. And let's say there are, let's see, what did I say, tempo 80? Perfect. So let's say there are 30-second notes articulated in the flute. Me being a flute player, I'm very well of where my limits are of articulation. And let's say there are two flute players, and one of them is French, with a very fine French articulation, which is very light. And they can play 30-second notes at tempo 80, no problem. And then another flute player happens to be from the United States, where they speak in a guttural tone, and then the taka 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 taka, and that speed is it's not possible for that flute player. So we already have a sort of discrepancy in terms of the difference of how speeds work between composer, score, and player.
Yeah.
Now, if you put them in a concert hall, then you all of a sudden have a special acoustic. And that acoustic may be very echoey. And maybe that very fast tempo is a blur, and then the music doesn't work. And so maybe the conductor or the ensemble decides, we must play it a little bit slower so that these notes work. And they take it at tempo 72. And that's exactly how music works and how scores work. It's because the score is not the piece of the music. The score is just the code, the notation to invite the performers to create the piece of music live in the space in which it is taking. And that's why we learn, which is famously known by all musicians, is that tempo indications from composers and scores are very flexible, let's say. And I always thought that leads to the question, is why are tempi able to be changed, but for example, pitches are not so flexible. If you play an F instead of an F sharp, we say that's wrong. But if you play tempo 72 instead of 80, they say, that's an interpretive choice.
Yeah. Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you so much, and welcome, of course, to Leiden University. And the examination will now be continued by Professor Emeritus De Groot, University of Amsterdam, and you're also welcome to Leiden.
Esteemed candidates, first of all, my congratulations with your dissertation, which is a very inclusive work involving composition, performance, space of performance, pedagogy also. Many aspects are involved in your work, and no doubt it will be a source of inspiration for both composers, musicians, and listeners as well, as well as scholars. Let me start with an anecdote. Once Louis Andriessen was driving with a friend with this in a car and during a conversation. It was a radio with music by Handel, and Andries was asking himself, what's going faster, my car or the music of Handel? And this was the source of inspiration for his work, the snelheid, speed.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a question about cultural exchange. When Stockhausen went to Japan in 1972, he was very much struck by the note theater. Extremely slow time speed and extremely fast. And he was inspired to incorporate this in his own composition. Could you reflect on the impact of cultural exchange in time and speed perception?
Hooggeleerde opponents, de Groot. When Stockhausen went to Japan, he visited Ryoanji, which is a famous rock garden in Kyoto. And I know this because I was there several years ago. And we see the picture of him there, and he talks about how he was inspired by the piece, and that inspired him to write slow music. But let me address the idea of cultural speeds, because this is one a big question which has actually been a huge part of my own artistic output, not in relation to no theater and Japanese art culture, but rather Indian culture. And the Carnatic music has been a huge source of inspiration for my own work for many decades, actually. And when I started this research, it seemed an obvious choice to explore what the Indians are doing and then bring that, and how I bring that into my own research. Briefly, when I embarked upon the question of what is speed in music, I immediately realized I didn't know, and I needed to build, and no one else knew, because I couldn't find a good definition. And so I needed to build frameworks in order to understand what speed is in music. And this is when I embarked upon this chapter 2, where I talk about the thresholds of speed, density and motion, smooth and striated time, the Lemmy model. And because those seemed foundational principles through which we can understand and interpret how speed works in music. And without those, I felt it was too vague. And then the second part of the question concerns my own work and the rest of those chapters. So the idea of the way the Indians use speed, and the way I understand it, is that the Sanskrit language, which plays a role in the texts for the religious songs in Carnatic music, they, through their creativity, they were able to find rhythmic cycles and rhythms that fit the syllabic structures of the Sanskrit. And that led to this rich complexity of rhythmic phrasing in Indian music. And so that's a really nice example of how the culture, the music comes out of the culture. And so it's really fascinating. It's a really great study. So is the music in Japan would be a really great study, and also the rhythmic approach to speed in African music. And what I realized is that that if I opened up this research into an intercultural research, ethnographic research, then I felt that I was going away from a little bit more this universal set of frameworks, which I built in this chapter 2, into ethnographic study, and then I felt it would open up too many interesting cans of worms that I would not be able to accommodate in one thesis. And so while I do talk a little bit about some of the rhythmic cycles from India and how some of my notational solutions for that, I largely stay away from trying to ascertain the essence of their cultural expressions, mostly because it's seated in their cultural identities. And in that respect, I chose to focus my domain in my own context, which is European culture.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The examination will now be continued by Professor Lindberg, Universiteit Leiden.
Thank you. Geachte kandidaat, thank you for a very enjoyable work indeed. I am a philosopher, and generally philosophers only manage to think about time through the opposition of two aspects. You mentioned two of those, two famous examples, smooth versus striated time in Deleuze, and clock time versus durée in Bergson. You show how music deconstructs such simple oppositions from the word go. Seen through your lens, each musical piece is a complex texture, fabric, weaving, or plate of different temporal layers. And that is really fascinating. So it seems to me that in your work, music manifests something like that I would like to call a theory of relativity of time, where time happens in some kind of localized knots, temporal knots, rather than simply following the traditional classical picture of the arrow of time, which runs from past towards the future. So my question now is, did I get this right? It seems to me that your theory of time has two aspects, the first of which is very clear and the second of which is a bit less clear to me. So I'd like you to elaborate on the latter one. So the first aspect is precisely this duality between time as regular grid versus experiential smooth duration. And this duplicity enriches the old idea of time as an arrow running from past to future. I have no objections whatsoever to your treatment of this. The second one is the event in which different layers of time are entangled and enmeshed together. And it seems to me that this entangling of different layers of time does not only happen in composition, where different speeds are superposed, but also between the different agents of the musical event. So there's the time of the musical piece. It's a combination of times of the composer, the performer, the listener, and I think also of the instrument. So that in some strange way, time happens between these different temporal agents. But how does this happen? Does time come from the one to the other? And if yes, how? Does the composer act as the striated time to the smooth time of the performer? And does the performer act as the striated time to the smooth time of the listener? Is the instrument a kind of an automat in which the performer tries to find creative possibilities so that in some sense the instrument would be the striated time in comparison with the smoother time of the performer? So I'm afraid that this question already points at the question you open at the very end of your work in view of future studies. How does speed in music illuminate the time itself? But perhaps you could give me just a preliminary idea of how time itself would be this kind of enmeshing of different temporalities.
Hooggeleerde opponent Lindberg, may I ask two questions first? Mm-hmm. You talked about temporal knots. Mm-hmm. So little moments or ties that are in the different layers of temporality. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, that's the idea. So you make sort of a plate of different layers of temporality, and that's the musical piece.
Yes.
That's how I imagined what you were explaining.
Okay, yes, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Indeed, when we talk about the flow of time in our daily experience, we say, oh, that went so fast, or it went so slow, right? We sum it up in one word. And we even might say that about music. But indeed, when we get out the magnifying glass, we start to realize, oh, the bass is moving slower than the treble, let's say, or the melody is irregular and the bass is regular, or these kinds of things. And then really quickly it becomes this complex situation. And how do we bring together all these different expressions of time at the same time? And that's the beautiful thing about music, is it's a really clear representation of that effect. And it's easy to study also, because we can look at scores and we can analyze recordings and we can hear these different layers. Coming back to the, well, a couple of points. Number one, the fact that a single note of a piece is part of the motive, the phrase, the section, and the composition, in each one of those different time scales has its own speed, we can say, already complicates our judgment of one note. We cannot say, oh, that note is, or those two notes are fast or slow, because it depends on what time scale you're talking about. Coming back to the smooth and striated concern, and why I find this so fascinating, even though it's also a simple polarity, but it's in the way these different smooth and striated qualities are combined in the music, which I find so interesting. And as much as I could read, I could not find the depth that was shows us in the music. And this is where it's interesting, is that if we play in a pulse and I play a melody right in time, you might say that that melody is striated. And we could look at the rhythms of that melody, and they might be more regular or less regular, which would then give it a more of a striation or less of a striation. But we can also look at the micro-timing of that melody. And that's where not only might be placing those notes at those rhythmic places, but I might be 20 milliseconds early or 50 milliseconds later. And this is where the essence of micro-timing, smooth time occurs. And the way I interpret that, in terms of its meaning, is basically comes down to expression. And in the case of live performed music, I see that as the location of where human expression is situated. So the way someone plays a melody and times that melody expresses the way they think of how that melody goes. And that's different than someone else, the way they would play the same melody. And so because of those two different versions, we understand something about each of these people and how they are different. And so that captures the essence of the human expression. And instead of thinking of the instrument as an instigator of smooth time, I think it's the human that is the instigator in the way they express. And of course, with composers, we can create music, we can use statistical tools, we can use math, and we can create smooth time that way, which are in a way, yeah, formulas and not human. And which is different than the composer who sings the piece and then writes it on the page. So it's been filtered through the body, which is a feeling of timing and decision taking, which is different than these more algorithmic tools for smooth time. And I find that to be the most interesting thing about this dichotomy, because is to locate where that human expression is. And indeed, striation is also it expresses a lot of things, but also looking at these smooth time expressions and how they reflect the human expression. And ultimately, I think that that's the reason we have music, is to hear those expressions and to learn about the way the performers think about the music and the way the composer has thought about the music. And so that brings it back to, what does it mean to be human? And this smooth and striated dichotomy has given me some coordinates to localize where those qualities are and how I can use them in my own composing and performing.
Okay, thank you. We will come back to the question of time later on in the
Okay.
in the free discussion. Thank
If
you.
you want to pose it now, you can also...
No, because it will be
All right.
long.
So much. The examination will now be continued by Dr. Kyriakides, University of the Arts, The Hague.
Thank you. Esteemed candidate, colleague, Ned, thank you very much for your thesis. I found it really interesting and a valuable contribution from a composer's point of view on ways to approach thinking about speed. I have a question about related to one of the chapters in the book, specifically on polytemporality, which I found fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Speed as a compositional concept comes most vividly to the fore with polytemporality, in my opinion, where the listener experiences two or more tempi or temporal striations, you could say, simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
One example is in West African drumming traditions, and I don't want you to necessarily go into that music specifically.
Yeah.
But the bifurcation, the split of this idea of entrainment, the listener's ability to hear the music in two metric frameworks at the same time, it is not a problem to be solved, but the expressive point of the music itself. Your polytempo chapter focuses largely on strategies for performers to resist entrainment, which frames polytemporality primarily as a technical and coordinative challenge. But could this type of bifurcated listener entrainment be understood as an expressive goal in its own right? And if so, how does that connect with the compositional decisions in a work like Sydney Polypulse, which you quote in that chapter?
Yeah.
So put simply, how do you understand and use the expressive potential of polytemporality in your music? And in where it would be nice to hear how, whether you use it really, these ideas inside the music, or like as a kind of hidden structure in the music, or let's say openly as a sort of rhetorical device from a compositional point of view.
Zeer geleerde opponents, Kyriakides, I feel that we are some combination of inventors and discoverers as composers. And when I embarked upon this polytempo research, which went through 3 different pieces, I was inventing and discovering at the same time. And so, and it starts with the tools. How do they work? Or how do they don't work? So if I play at tempo 60 and my friend plays at tempo 63, how can we maintain that? And it turns out it's very difficult to do, because that's a phase of 20 seconds long when we take those 2 tempo combinations. But it's beautiful. I was immediately taken by the beauty of these kinds of slowly moving phases of the polytempo situation. But immediately I encountered a whole range of variables, things I needed to solve, a lot of problems, and a lot of decisions to take. And so then I went through a real methodical approach to try to answer those questions. And that led me to understanding, discovering, or figuring out the length of a phase, because in my case, this all was basically based on the phase. And then maybe I will come back to the polytempo texture in the end. But first of all, I was thinking about how long does that phase last? And you can make a 20-second phase, and it can be from this tempo, but we can also make a 20-second phase at a faster tempo. So I immediately sort of triangulated, oh, we have two different variables here. We have the base tempo, and we have the length of the phase. And that is how we can create these different variations. So I systematically tried a bunch of things, and then took a decision for Sydney polypoles.
Yeah. Can I interrupt there for a
yes,
second?
please.
So the fact that you're talking about phasing implies that you want the listener to experience it in a kind of structural way, that they hear the 20 seconds, oh, it's coming together again, it's going, is that so?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's a story. And it starts out together, it really slowly goes apart, then somewhere you're in the middle, and then there's this approaching. There's a real cadential feel to it as they approach unison. And so I was looking at that. Coming to the form possibilities, as I started to figure, because this was a sextet, and each musician had a 60, 61, 62, 63, one beat apart tempo.
So the phase is very long.
The phase is long, and it's also multiple because you have 6 different people playing at the same time. And so actually you largely get a cacophony of pulses going at the time. Yeah. Yet because of the choice in speed, when you listen to it, you can start to hear these phases going on. So there was a sort of, it created, in my impression, both a texture, a sound of, like crickets in the field, of cacophony of sounds, but we could also start to, as we start to really listen to it, you could start to hear this really slow movement of the voices against each other. And so that was interesting for me to discover that we could kind of have both of those qualities at the same time. Right. And I had to, calculate it precisely to kind of...
So in a sense, you want the listener to experience, let's say, a harmony and dissonance of, like, rhythmic convergence and divergence.
Yes. And then, to create the form of the entire piece, I started combining that with the other parameters of music, like pitch and longer note lengths and dynamics and those kinds of things. And then, really quickly, I would come to maybe 6 or 7 different possibilities. And then it was a question of, like, well, let's try to put that together into a story which unfolds in a logical or musical way, or dramatic way.
Narrative, yeah. Okay. No, thank you for that insight into your thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the examination will now be continued by Professor Emeritus Borgdorff, Leiden University.
Waarde kandidaat. Let me first thank you for the wonderful and convincing presentation of your artistic work yesterday in Utrecht.
Thank you.
I've already praised your scholarly work in my written assessment of your thesis, so I do not have to repeat this here. My question concerns the relationship between your work, or more generally, artistic research, and the field of cognitive science. To set the stage, let me refer to a conference or more a symposium organized in 2 weeks from now in Brussels by Luca, School of the Arts, under the title Mind, Art, Knowledge, Dialogues Between Cognitive Science, Artistic Practice and Philosophy. Here is a description of the program, I quote, "How can artistic practice produce knowledge? How can artists learn to generate and articulate knowledge via their practice? And how can philosophy of mind and cognitive science help us understand and perhaps expand this epistemic potential?" This 3-day symposium explores these questions by bringing together artists, artistic researchers, philosophers, and cognitive scientists. It will investigate how artistic knowing emerges from the interplay of perception, embodiment, and cognition, and how it can be articulated in dialogue with philosophy and science. End of quote. I noticed that you are not listed as a speaker at that conference, which is a pity. Therefore, I would like to ask you to share your thoughts here and now on the interrelationship between artistic research and cognitive science, leaving philosophy aside for a moment. In your dissertation, you've addressed this in some paragraphs. Here, I would like you to focus maybe on what artistic research specifically can learn from cognitive science, but more even the other way around, what cognitive science can learn from artistic research. I have a follow-up question, but maybe there's no time for that. So please, curious to hear your answer.
Hooggeleerde opponent, Borgdorff. The first thing when I started embarking upon this question of what is speed in music was to try to understand how does that work in the human body. And that led me to reading cognitive science and studies about how fast can we perceive pitches or notes, and it's the cognitive science is so powerful because they will say this rule about the way the body works, and it's right? And I was always in awe of the power of science, actually. And I've been constantly balancing in this artistic work, where's the power in what I'm doing and what we are doing as artists? And let me give you one example. Regarding this Sydney Polypulse piece, and we did some experimentation with different types of metronomes. And you can have a metronome that's clicking, like we're used to. We can have a beep, which you can see. And now they have these haptic metronomes you can wear on your wrist or on your body, and you can feel the pulse. And absolutely, this has been studied, the accuracy of people following the pulse in these different modalities. And the results are, an audible metronome is the most accurate, a haptic metronome is a close second, and the visual metronome is a distant third. And when I originally did the first Polypulse piece, Building Music, I had told the musicians, put the metronome on your stand on silent and just have it blinking, and then follow that. And the results were sometimes okay, but it was really difficult to get that to sound right. And we could practice, and I could, focus on that, and it improved, but it never got to where I was really happy. And then a different Polypulse piece, one group had used these inner ear metronomes, and then they could, all of a sudden, the Polypulse technique started to sound like it does, like it should. But the problem with putting an earpiece in your ear is you cannot hear around, and we're dealing with music, which is a sounding art, and you want to have your ears open. So when they invented this haptic metronome, which would then pulse your wrist, this was a good solution because it would, you could feel it, but you could also use your ears and your mind to listen around and play music like we do in chamber music situation, balancing the levels and stuff. And so I got 6 of these metronomes, and the musicians tried them all out. And another piece of the science said, the more distant the metronome is from the mind, the less accurate it is. But we were trying them all out, and the percussionist of Sydney Polypulse, she decided to wear it on her ankle. And she said, well, this is what works for me. And so this was an interesting moment of where the practicality went against what the science says. And, but it wasn't a scientific test. If it works for her, great. And she played it great. So what happened is what I realized is that, oh, the science will say one thing, but the situation of playing music is so multifaceted, and there's so many variables going on that it's not necessarily universal truths, these scientific studies. And musicians will find a way, and they may do other things and combine it in different ways that were not studied that also work really well. For example, I found that the haptic metronome works really well when you also combine it with the visual. And when you're dealing with these really subtle polypulse speeds, you need to have as steady of an anchor as possible. So I say this as an example to demonstrate the kinds of knowledges that come out of the artistic practice, which may be different than what cognitive science might mean.
Okay, thank you very much. Convinced, yes. I have a follow-up, but maybe later.
Later, yeah. Thank you so much. And now the examination will be continued by Dr. Now I'm a bit in doubt. Is it Schaefer or is it Schaefer? Schaefer. I thought so. Dr. Schaefer, Leiden University, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Esteemed candidates, very nice to read the work that has been long in the making, and that parts I recognize and parts are wonderful new additions. And it follows on really nicely to the previous points that you've been really voracious in finding all these different accounts of speed and how rhythm affects people, but also taking this somewhat more unusual approach of thinking about it from the composer's or the performer's perspective, which of course my world coming from psychology has been pretty squarely listener-oriented. And so, of course, my question also relates to how people listen and some of these theoretical frameworks that you've touched upon to kind of make sense of what you see in practice and to sort of contextualize this. And you've written you've given the dynamic attending theory, the sort of Mary Rees Jones's work, quite a central position there. And this left me thinking also about a different account that is partly overlapping, but also sometimes countered against this theoretical account, which is predictive processing work, which basically states that we are listening for the things that we can predict. Right? And that if we cannot predict something, then it kind of adds a little bit of extra attention because it's unpredicted, basically. Or even it violates a prediction that we had. So what I am curious about is whether this account could provide a bit more mechanistic, in your opinion, could provide a bit more mechanistic explanation for the different things happening at different timescales, right? So predictive coding accounts are inherently hierarchical, so the different levels feed into each other. And so I think this works really nicely with your formulation of the macro, meso, micro levels. And I'm wondering how you see this, if you think these things match or whether they actually clash.
So your earlier opponents, you're talking about the perception of different time scales. I didn't quite understand the listener's perspective from time scales.
Right. So the theoretical account of rhythm perception from the viewpoint of a predictive processing framework basically focuses more on predicting the future rather than in training with the present. If we put it very in a very summarized way. So what it does add is this hierarchical nature
that kind of feeds into these different levels. And I'm wondering if you've ever considered this as a potential sort of mechanistic explanation for the things that you see in your practice.
Absolutely. And there are so many connections. Let me start with one. If with the striated time, of course, if we set up a framework and a time, then you expect the next one here. And as a composer, I think that's great because it gives me a tool to not put it there. So I can start to play with that predictive function in the listener. In terms of the time scales, for example, in the piece that I improvised last night, this new torrent, this is a piece where time scales really plays a big role in how that piece functions, because I'm creating it in real time, and of course I'm thinking about the notes and the fingerings and sound and dynamics and paying attention to my breathing and stuff. But I'm also considering the materials and how long the materials should last, which already jumps from a micro localized time scale to a meso time scale, where we consider that. And I'm also thinking about where this is going in the long-term scale, in the long-term form. And I know this as a listener myself. I love to listen to music and predict where it's going. And I think this is one of the reasons why music is so fascinating, is we're listening to where the music has been, we're listening to where it is, and we're predicting where it's going, and then there's a conversation between our predictions and what actually happens, just like any story will have, right?
Yes. Can I add something? Like,
yes.
I'm curious about how you think these levels interact, right? So if something happening in the macro level changes what you predict in the micro, or the other way around, right? Because that's what this account actually offers, of these a closer connection of these different time scales and their influence on each other.
Yeah. Of course they're connected, but they're also independent. And concurrent. So indeed, I might be going towards a high note climactic end, and I might be wiggling my fingers on low notes here, and I know I'm going to there, and I'm judging how fast that's going to go. So this is their connection. But indeed, it's also a very different type of material than where I'm going to. And the way that story unfolds, like I said, is part of the beauty of music, this unfolding of ideas. So yeah, how could I say that further? Because like for example, in the first piece I played, there are some moments where we have surprises, and moments where the music stops and then starts. And those are built into the way this piece works. And so, and other times, it's extremely predictable. It just goes on and on and on, and it builds step by step. And these different changes in the relationships between the materials on different time scales and different types of materials is part of that interplay, which we composers are often building into our pieces to, well, like tell a good story, right? Which is somewhat predictable and has coherency with characters, but also...
Thank you.
Esteemed candidates, the time allotted for the defense of your dissertation and the accompanying propositions has expired. The committee will withdraw to deliberate. Please remain here and await our return patiently.
Rise, please.
Esteemed candidate, we have examined your dissertation along with the accompanying propositions. We've heard your defense this afternoon, and we've taken note of the faculty's report regarding the examinations that you have completed before being formally admitted to the defense. On these grounds, we have decided to confer upon you the degree of doctor. Professor Corbeson is hereby authorized to confer this distinction on you in the customary manner.
Volgaarne aanvaard ik de taak mij door de rector magnificus der Universiteit opgedragen. Uit kracht dan van de bevoegdheid ons bij wet toegekend, volgens het besluit van de commissie hier tegenwoordig, verklaar ik bij deze u, Ned McGowan, te bevorderen tot dokter. En ten bewijze hiervan zal u het diploma door rector, secretaris en promotoren ondertekend en met het grootzegel der universiteit bevestigd ter hand worden gesteld. Having thus fulfilled the duty entrusted to me, may I be the first to address you as doctor and to offer you my warmest congratulations on having been awarded the doctoral degree. Regard it as an honor and a well-deserved privilege, but never forget the responsibilities it entails in the eyes of science, the arts, and society as a whole. Always act in accordance with the principles of academic and artistic integrity, honesty, care, transparency, independence, and responsibility.
Dankjewel. Ned, I think we first encountered each other soon after your arrival in the Netherlands, and I remember that within a short time you were involved in curating a concert series in Amsterdam under the title Carnatic Lab, in one concert of which I had the privilege of participating. At that time, you were already distinguishing yourself as a fearless interpreter of contemporary flute music, as well as an adept of the rhythmical intricacies of Carnatic music, and indeed discovering connections between these seemingly quite distinct approaches to musical expression. So when you began your research into speed in music, that didn't come as a surprise to me. What was more unexpected was that in the meantime, you had also extended your musical involvements to encompass composition, with a razor-sharp focus on the admirable and these days no longer so common principle of what music might emerge if you do this. The result has been an intimate interweaving of creativity and research. You've systematically immersed yourself in speculation about what it means for music to be slow or fast or both or neither, and put a remarkable musical virtuosity to work as your experimental apparatus. And we don't have to take your word for the findings because we can hear them so clearly and fascinatingly in the compositions. So congratulations, Ned, on this unique achievement.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the university and of course on behalf of myself, it's my pleasant duty, most learned Dr. McGowan, to congratulate you on the well-deserved degree and I hereby declare this ceremony closed.